Mondays with Mike. So, we'll begin with Doge versus USAID. Do people say USAID or do they just say USAID?
I think that's a personal choice. I personally say USAID.
On February 3rd, NBC Nightly News reported Hallie Jackson speaking. Also playing out tonight, a sprawling effort to scale back parts of the federal government in a push led by Elon Musk and President Trump facing new questions about the role of the unelected billionaire. Here's senior White House correspondent Kelly O'Donnell. Kelly O'Donnell says, "Tonight, this partnership of power, under intense new scrutiny, President Trump and the world's richest man, Elon Musk, upending federal agencies to overhaul government and slash spending." The rest of the report will be listed on our website. It's been widely reported over the last few weeks, the efforts of the Department of Government Efficiency. I then asked Mike off microphone why NBC would specifically say that he was an unelected billionaire, given that it's obvious that he was unelected and a billionaire, but that everyone who Trump appoints in the executive branch was unelected, but Trump was elected. So why the focus on that in particular for Elon Musk? Mike responds,
I think the big issue is actually accountability. So Musk is categorized as a special employee. So a bunch of the checks that are usually in place to provide some measure of oversight for ethical standards or some kind of guardrail for federal employees don't exist for Musk. And the big one is that there was no Senate confirmation or advisor consent process. It's not clear that he's gone through any of the normal scrutiny or vetting. And so there's certain ethical questions that are really concerning in terms of the power that he's been given, in the sense that it's not clear that he even can wield the power that he's been given. Just because Trump's the president doesn't mean that Trump can imbue people with all the powers of the government, because some of those powers are reserved for people who've gone through that process of being like a cabinet level official or going through at least some level of scrutiny before being given so much power. And so I think that's why they keep mentioning that, is that the billionaire part's important because it's referencing his conflicts of interest. So if Musk
I
was
see.
just working for the federal government, okay. But the problem is that Musk has huge stakes in a lot of different companies. Some of those companies are competing for federal contracts directly with other competitors in the market. Think space in particular right now, because NASA isn't doing the shuttle program so much anymore, or going into space as much with actual shuttles. And so it's either Boeing or Bezos or Musk, those are the big ones, who are doing a lot of the heavy lifting of bringing people to the International Space Station, bringing people back from the International Space Station. It's SpaceX that's the one that's transporting a lot of goods up into space and bringing stuff back from space, right? And because they have all sorts of proprietary technology, sure, they can compete, but the big issue has to do with all these conflicts of interest. And because we had no real scrutiny or process to understand the full extent of what those conflicts of interest are, we don't know who he owes money to, who owes money to him, how those decisions might influence his decision making while wielding such vast amounts of power over federal spending and federal payroll. So
Mm.
those are some of the concerns that I see.
That's a concise summary, and it makes sense to me because that's the Constitution, right? That the president has to rule with the advice and consent of Congress on certain matters. And has Elon Musk been confirmed?
No, it was an executive order that made him a specific category of employee within the federal government that's completely removed in some senses from the ethical standards that your regular average federal civil service employee has to follow. Things like Git and ethical reporting requirement. There's a whole list of exceptions that are made for special employees, which allows Musk to sort of operate uninhibited.
oh, so special employee is like a special category of...
Absolutely. So he is an employee of the federal
Uh-huh.
government because there was an executive order that made him so, but he enjoys certain protections that most employees do not, and certain exemptions from how he can act that most employees do not have. And that's the big
Mhm.
deal here, is that Congress is supposed to provide oversight over all of government, right? That's one of their roles. They decide on funding priorities and all that and what's important for enforcement. This is trying to circumvent all of it, that Musk can operate at a whole separate level than everyone else.
It reminds me, I read probably in the American history textbook from 11th grade, American Pageant by Kennedy. Post Watergate, scholars kind of assumed in the late 1970s Congress has now triumphed, maybe not triumphed, but asserted its dominance, whatever, over the president, and now Congress is going to be the dominant branch of government. And then, the 80s on, that's not what we saw. We saw an entrenchment of the imperial presidency. I do wonder, after this, all of these executive orders, it would seem to me that my congressman is the person who is going to represent me more than any given president. Therefore, would it be better if it was, more legislative? Or, I don't know, what kind of guardrails can be put up against this happening in the future?
Yeah, so the big issue right now is that the guardrails that do exist and are supposed to protect against such widespread action so quickly aren't being enforced. And the problem is that Supreme Court ruling that said that the president's virtually immune from being prosecuted for official actions, and it's a very broad category of what that means, and the Supreme Court gets to ultimately decide if it becomes an issue, what that continues to mean if it's brought up through the appeals courts, et cetera, if there's a lawsuit. And there are a lot of lawsuits right now over what's going on because there's supposed to be, for instance, for employees being hired, there's all sorts of labor protections that are supposed to protect them because they have agreements through their union. It's one of the largest unions in the country. So you would expect that those at least should be followed, but in some cases it appears they're not. And some of the other things like reporting requirements. So you have to give someone notice in some cases before you can fire them, however many days it is, depending on each different agreement. And it doesn't look like that notice is always being followed, which is frightening. But in terms of your question, the number one check that's supposed to exist is the spending power, is Article 1, right? That Congress gets to choose how money is appropriated, how it's spent. And Congress didn't like the fact that a president was trying to usurp that power with Nixon when he tried to change how spending was done with something called impoundment, where they just redirect funds to something else. And so they passed a law, and the law said you can't do this without first asking Congress for any rescission of funds, and then Congress has to respond within a certain window of time for you to go forward. It's the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, where they established a process by which there's supposed to be a check on this kind of speed with which the funding has been cut off so quickly. There was already supposed to be a law in place that said explicitly you cannot do this. You can't take money that's already been appropriated by Congress and then spend it or not spend it anywhere else. It has to go for where they said it has to go. It's as close to a constitutional crisis as it gets because the power of spending isn't the president's job. It's Congress, 100%. The president's supposed to just distribute the money how Congress says and make sure it gets distributed. He's canceling just huge numbers of programs. So where we're at right now is going to be litigated. And the only other
Mhm.
guardrail is the judiciary. And already the judiciary has indicated that they're siding with the president with that ruling that said that the president has broad immunity from prosecution, right? If someone can't be prosecuted, then the system
Mhm.
is only as strong as the structures put in place to keep it strong, right? That checks and
Mhm.
balances concept. And if the president decides to just ignore all court orders or ignore, say, for instance, they try the 25th Amendment, the cabinet
Mhm.
decides, oh, we don't think that the president can do the job anymore.
And the cabinet's Trump appointees, too, so.
Yeah,
So,
that's the whole issue is it looks like the majority power in government right now is marching in lockstep. And one of the main reasons that Nixon resigned when Watergate happened was that the House and the Senate signaled to Nixon, we are going forward with impeachment. You will
Yeah.
probably lose. There will be a huge trial. It's going to not look great. And Nixon, seeing the way the wind was going, decided, okay, I'm not going to win this particular political conflict and resign. For this current president, he's already been impeached, didn't resign, right? That it doesn't appear that there's any kind of checks. That's where it gets really complicated, because even if the Democrats regain control of both the House and the Senate, which they could, right? They could. It's historically, it does happen. It's not clear that if he is actually impeached, that he would leave. That's where it gets complicated. The current situation, that if they actually voted to kick him out of office and it went through and succeeded, it's not clear that he would actually leave.
That would be the worst day in our country's history if a president did not leave upon being scheduled or required to leave. But to backtrack a little bit here, I'm tracking with what you're saying, and I really appreciate the explanation. And yes, Congress has power over the purse. But let me just make a series of analogies, and we'll see where the analogies fall apart. A cop need not pull someone over if they are going 65 and a 60, right? There would be something of prosecutorial or enforcement discretion, correct?
Yeah, there is discretion, yeah.
And in a similar way, a president doesn't enforce all laws with the same degree of vigor. We can see this in TikTok with both presidents. I'm not going to do that. We can see this in the current drug laws, where they're illegal federally, but some states do it, and the federal government essentially does nothing about it. I'm not going to say nothing, but lets it fester. Lets it occur. So there is prosecutorial discretion as well. Mike nods. Okay. But this just wouldn't extend to the disbursement of money. Is that right? The president must just hand out all the money, so he can't exert any discretion on monies handed out?
So the law explicitly states that any deviation has to be justified to Congress, and Congress has to approve the rescission of funds. So there is a process. In your example of prosecutorial discretion, there is no one they have to really justify it to. If the prosecutor is the one who decides whether to charge or not charge, same with cops, that they generally have some latitude of who to pursue based off of whatever reasons they have. In this case, the law is explicit that there is no discretion. All funds, in terms of if Congress has appropriated the money, if they passed a bill and a president signed that bill, then the president doesn't just have a total veto after that's happened of all funds that have been appropriated. That's why this current issue is so complicated, is because USAID and these other agencies were created by acts of Congress. Their funding was appropriated by Congress. It was signed into law by a president who was duly elected. And so the current president can't just ignore all of the past, elected leaders' actions with, a sentence.
Yeah, can't abrogate it.
There is an actual process that has to be followed. And if that process isn't followed, in a working world, in a world where the laws are actually being, enforced in the way that they're written, none of those orders would have actually gone through. Like, they couldn't have cut all the funding in one fell swoop of all these employees and just said, okay, here's the door. There would have had to have been some kind of administrative process to stop it until it got resolved, to make sure that the order was legal. And the current issue is that the existing check on whether something is or isn't legal in terms of the president's executive order goes through the courts, and the courts have already signaled that there's wide latitude in terms of what it constitutes an official act of being able to sue for redress of grievances in this case. And so that's why this current situation is so messy. And messy is the word. We're going to see a lot of lawsuits every single time one of these departments or agencies has their funding reduced or their huge numbers of employees fired. Like right now, it's looking like the EPA, the Department of Education. It's looking like they're going after the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. and obviously USAID right now. In all of those circumstances, the money's been appropriated. They were created by an act of Congress. Only Congress can abolish them. There's no ambiguity here because there's supposed to be three co-equal branches of government. We don't have a
Ah.
king. Executive does not control all three branches of government. They're supposed to check each other. And if those checks don't work, then we have what's called a constitutional crisis.
Tune in next episode for the conclusion of this exciting discussion segment concerning Doge, USAID, and the alleged constitutional crisis. So, next issue. What do you know about DeepSeek?
Not very much other than that it exists. It's the number one app or it was the number one app on the store for free apps. And there are a lot of questions about national security due to how it tracks keystrokes and various other things. Also, that because it's a technology that is right at the forefront of emerging technologies, AI,
Yep.
there are not ethical standards in place and enforcement mechanisms in place to mitigate the potential harms of the technology if it captures huge amounts of information really fast.
I agree. The app version is not something that I am going to use on my devices. However, there is this open source model. You bring up a good security perspective. Good thing there are ways around it for now. On January 27th, 2025, NBC Nightly News had the following report on DeepSeek AI, which will be linked at the Mondays with Mike website. Lester. Now to a rough day for the markets, with Nvidia losing nearly $600 billion in value, triggered by a major AI advancement in China that U.S. officials are already warning could be a national security threat. Later, Brian Chung says, Wall Street is shaken by how cheaply its developers say they were able to train the AI model DeepSeek for just $5.6 million, they claim. Now, if true, that would be more efficient in terms of money spent on a single AI model compared to how much it cost to train ChatGPT and Google's Gemini AI, which were made here in the US. Lester Holt asks, big question for a lot of users. Will this have the same national security concerns as we saw with TikTok? Brian Chung. Well, it could. DeepSeek's terms of use are governed by China, and it raises serious questions over censorship and guided answers. Now, DeepSeek says it collects users' keystrokes and stores information on Chinese servers. Some lawmakers on Capitol Hill have already expressed concern, and it's a good reminder, by the way, Lester, to never give your personal sensitive information to any AI software. That's information that people would take well to heed. The app, I would not enter any kind of information on the app. However, the technology is pretty exciting to me. And here's why. So you know how AI, like ChatGPT and the rest, were trained on materials, much of which was copyrighted. Did they have permission to use it? They say ChatGPT makes the argument it's fair use. But then DeepSeek trains its AI on the other AIs. So is that fair use? And they were able to do it very cheaply. Perhaps not as cheaply as they claim, but who knows. They were able to train it using AI. What do you think of that? Isn't that what we would call a double bind for American AI companies concerning fair use?
It's certainly telling that they all panicked and responded with such outrage to what happened. If I was cynical, I would say that the current AI system was set up to engage in rent seeking behavior, that they were engaging in a sort of feedback loop of trying to make as much money as they could in the early days of AI. And so maybe there wasn't as much effort to safeguard some of the technology as much as just advancing the technology to a degree that they can make it marketable to stakeholders. I think that it's funny. You're right. There is an irony that they're using the claim of fair use to train on existing AI models. But if you look at the way that the US was trying to keep China and these other markets from even using these products was through extreme controls on chips and certain equipment to be used by these companies like DeepSeek in China, that they had to be creative in addressing to even compete in this marketplace. It's complicated, right? Because the whole notion of copyright is that you can prove a replicable technology or process that is your own so that you can then profit from it. And I am very skeptical of any technology that utilizes huge amounts of other people's material and then claims through that huge amount of use of other people's material that they have an exclusive right to profit from using all those other people's material without compensating them. Because the whole notion of copyright is that if you do something unique, you should be paid for having done that thing, right? And so it's complicated. This is going to be litigated, no question, because everyone wants to figure out why it happened, how it happened. And it's also scary. If they can create a technology that's uh, at par with these very expensive technologies that had supposedly more safeguards, $6 million in the grand scheme of things isn't that much money compared to what they were saying it was going to cost, which means that a lot more people can advance the technology way faster than safeguards can be put in place to protect systems from that technology.
We need to be careful about AI. I personally am not all too concerned about AGI right now. What I am concerned about is the erosion that might occur in education as a result of this. I can sometimes tell if something was written by AI, but can I always tell? I don't know. Hopefully the technology will develop later on where you can use AI to detect AI, and I think that it actually will. So I'm concerned that it's going to hurt the education of high school and college students. That would be my primary concern at this juncture. Along with fraud and stuff, but I think we can deal with that, but we can't exactly deal with lost time in the classroom of yet more children, or young adults in the case of university students.
I think the biggest concern I have for AI, education is certainly important, but the biggest concern I have is AI being used to take over either weapon systems or critical infrastructure. So AI being used to shut down a dam, AI being used to keep a bridge lifted, AI being used to stop ships from moving in traffic lanes so that you clog up the works and create geopolitical problems that lead to massive wars. Also, AI being used to take over planes, trains, automobiles, anything that can fly, anything that can go under the surface, and anything in space, right? It would be really terrible if someone figures out how to use AI to bring all the satellites down all at once. And if there aren't adequate safeguards in place right now and every day that these technologies keep proliferating to stop them from doing that, especially if the technology isn't as understood apparently as it's supposed to be. These companies were valued very highly in the marketplace because they said they had a very good understanding of AI, and then DeepSeek comes along and says, "Oh, we'll do what you say you can do at a fraction of the price." Uh-oh. If they can do it, can other people do it too? And how
Yeah.
many? And we don't know. And if we don't know what the potential ramifications are in the long term. And the future wars of humanity are going to be fought with AI and computers and
To a degree,
very
yeah.
to a big degree if they can get away with it, right? Because human soldiers are expensive and mortal. AI can
Mhm.
live forever.
Yeah, all the things you're saying are worthy of taking a look at, certainly. I would say that if a weapon system or any other system you're talking about, a bridge, a dam, etc., was vulnerable to human hacking, that it will be 10,000 or more times more vulnerable to AI hacking, hacking by AI, certainly. Because the way I think about it is AI is not as smart as humans in terms of capacity to reason. I would even say not even close. However, it is way faster than humans in terms of ability to think about 10,000 possibilities at a single moment, and it does it quickly. In a game that requires reasoning, I don't think we are in jeopardy yet, but hacking is often about repeat trials of a known weakness. And in that respect, you are quite right, and if anybody was worried about hacking, they should be way more worried now. I think there are countermeasures that can be taken now, and I think they will prevent most things, but you need to keep looking at it over the course of time. As far as DeepSeek goes, the product of DeepSeek is not as good as the product of ChatGPT. It's significantly more prone to just start giving wrong answers. But per amount of money deployed on DeepSeek, it's a win. It's a big win for technology, and I think the cat is out of the bag. And given that a Chinese company has done it to this level, some other company could do it to a still further level. However, I don't think that advances the reasoning capacity of AI, but we're certainly into the AI world. About a year ago, I wasn't so sure about it. Now I'm sure.
I mean, AI doesn't eat, it doesn't sleep, it doesn't want retirement, it doesn't need healthcare. It can go all day, every day, so long as there's enough electricity to power it. And so, if nefarious actors really want to make something happen using AI, and AI becomes cheap enough, or inexpensive enough, or accessible enough, especially through open source code like DeepSeek apparently is, the future is going to be written by whoever gets there first and who innovates the fastest. And it's not always the case that those who innovate are ethical actors or good actors. And so I think the lag time for government safeguarding these issues is way too long for how fast the innovation's going.
Quick shout out to the YouTube channel Dave's Garage and the YouTuber Dave Plummer for informing Bud's perspective on DeepSeek for this episode. That video will be linked at the Mondays with Mike website. We'll see you next week here on Mondays with Mike.